Hi, folks. It's Gary here, and a very warm welcome back to the fourth official here on YouTube. Only one story has dominated the landscape in Scottish football over the course of the last 24 hours. We are, of course, talking about the breaking news we brought you last night regarding the takeover talks that Rangers have been apparently now involved in for the last few months with parties from San Francisco 49ers, also involved at Leeds United, of course. Joining me to make sense of what's been a crazy 24 hours once again is my co-host and kind of co-contributor here on the fourth official once again. It's Mitch. Mitch, how the hell are we? It's been a crazy few days.
It's no half, mate. We tuned in on Monday there and the world was looking bleak, and then all of a sudden, fast forward the last 24 hours, and we're on a magic carpet and we're all ready to make Rangers great again.
Yeah, it's been a crazy ride, I think, since the news broke around about tea time last night. Um, First of all, bit of scepticism because it originated in the Daily Record and Keith Jackson, and I think we all know our opinions regarding the, that source and how that can be. But the fact it was then picked up pretty quickly by every other media organisation, including Sky Sports, and then Rangers Review, like the Keith Jack, didn't downplay it, and then Rangers, um, by commenting no comment, kind of that in itself kind of told you everything you needed to know about it. That there was some substance to it, and over the course of today, it's continued to grow arms and legs to the point where we now know that this is possibly further down the line than even last night made it look.
I think that's it, and I think, do you know something? We've touched on this before, obviously, on a transfer level of 9 times out of 10, nobody knows what we are doing until we announce it or until somebody's in for a medical, like, and I think that shows you that under the current stewardship, whether that be previous under Gilligan or now obviously under Patrick Stewart and Fraser Thornton there, I think it shows you that the shop is very much shut in terms of what comes in and what comes out the club. It's a bit more controlled, and I think we've had little, we've been fed little crumbs every so often that something like this has been on the horizon. Like when places like Ineos, for example, were mentioned at the AGM, and you know there's been some polite chatter about we are actively looking for additional investment. Maybe the Dave King comments, from way back in September hold a bit of scope now of, maybe there is investor fatigue or investors have realised that they have, and credits where it's due. They took us on at a time where, let's be honest, we weren't that attractive a proposition, and they've maybe taken us as far as their pockets can take us.
Yep. Interesting. A lot of the news that's kind of came out today, Mitch, has been in and around who's been driving the talks, both not only from Rangers End, but also from 49ers Enterprises. We spoke yesterday about the current chairman of Leeds United, um, actually butchered his name last night, but Parag Marath is obviously heading up what's believed to be this kind of significant kind of consortium that apparently has been talking with Rangers since as far back as October. And I think we've seen a lot of people starting to kind of make a bit of sense in terms of a lot of the noises that have been coming out of Rangers, particularly since Patrick Stewart and Fraser Thornton came in. With this new regime, the fact that there's not been a great deal of business done in January, this internal review, which by all accounts looks as if it's been a little bit of due diligence done in the background as
Just
well, and
a
it's maybe
touch.
been a bit of a kind of smoke screen. But in terms of trying to kind of make the club get its house in order to make them a much more attractive proposition for an entity such as 49ers Enterprises to come in and look at it and bring some fresh ideas, some fresh money to the table, which is obviously vastly needed, but also a level of kind of professionalism and actual proper managing a well functioning sports function, which I think is something that can be massively thrown at. the previous Rangers boards over the last kind of 10 years, as much as there's been lots of Rangers men in there, in terms of footballing and sporting operations, that's not necessarily something that's high up on their CV in terms of what they're good at. And
Do you know?
that's even in terms of how successful we've been over the last kind of 10 years or so.
I think you and I touched on this obviously when Patrick Stewart was announced as the CEO. And we're having to, bring the. There's been a lot happened, shall we say, since that, since then. And you and I talked on camera and off camera about how Patrick Stewart, and I called this from day one when Patrick was brought into the club, where I said I would not be surprised if down the road Patrick Stewart and then when Fraser Thornton then came on board were brought in to basically restructure the club to make it a sellable asset, which now makes things like the low value player trading model that we did in the summer to get rid of high earners who were essentially loss leaders and debt makers. You know, essentially you get shot of the deadwood. Yes, you take short term hit in the arm in terms of the transfer fee, but it then increases the scope to play with in terms of financial fair play going forward. Whether that be at the time we may or may not have thought it was under the current custodianship, quite clearly as time has progressed. You know, there's maybe this has been in the works for maybe even longer than what we thought. But I think, as you say, the problem that we've probably had as a club is we have had a very large collection of businessmen running the club, but not sports minded businessmen. So in terms of that, and we've seen this, and we've been crying out for it since '55 of that lack of upper deck structure. There's not been a sporting director. We've ran through a couple of different chairmen. We've ran through different pieces and different bits, and we all knew this sitting in the terraces that there were so many senior holes to fill, and the club seemed to either give it to their pals or basically just make a rip roaring backside out of the appointments that they made. You know, but it now starts to make sense with things like the previous commercial director leaving and things like that. Of more and more layers of fat were getting cut out the club to basically say, here is the shell that is available for somebody else to mould into their own model. And when you look at Patrick Stewart's previous involvement, obviously with the Ineos deal at Man United, Fraser Thornton has a wealthy track record and in the world of business there for merging businesses, selling businesses overseas, and everything else. These appointments start to make much more sense when you look a little bit more below the surface of what these guys have done.
Yeah, and we've spoken a lot about looking under the hood and Fraser Thornton and Patrick Stewart realizing what they've walked into, and as you've stated, it has been a badly functioning footballing operation now for a number of years, and cries towards the director's box of you don't know what you're doing and get out of their club must have been very painful to Rangers men such as John Gilligan and previously John Bennett, um, the Parks, all very well-minded people. But what this cries out to me is actually that the egos of these people actually aren't going to stand in the way of what potentially could be a very positive thing in terms of the long-term future of the club, and as they try to get back to challenging and being the number one club in Scotland again, because at the moment we're nowhere near that, and it's going to require, as we said, some fresh thinking, new money, new ideas, new structure to get us back to that place. And let's be honest, that's where 49ers enterprises are coming in, if they are coming in.
Hmm.
It's not to have games against St Mirren and Motherwell, it's to try and get Rangers competing at the top table of European football rather than where we are just now in terms of being very competitive, but at level two.
Yeah, that's it. And I think as well, you look at what the 49ers group have done in Leeds in particular. And I know some of the Leeds fans didn't like the relegation clauses, for example, that were in certain player contracts of, sure, if we get relegated from the Premier League, you can leave on loan, but you won't leave for a sale. Because at that point, this is where that sports enterprise knowledge comes in of they know dropping down a division, people are going to come in and vulture pick your best players at that point, and they're going to say, they're going to come in and say, this player here, like Willie Gronto, for example, great example of it. You know, there was rumours that Everton, West Ham, and a couple of other clubs were trying to sniff about for in the region. I think it was about 15 to 20 million pound. Whereas when they were in the Premier League, clubs were sniffing about the same player for 40 million pound. And I think having those relegation clauses, it was also shrewd business, but it was also very, very savvy of right. Look, we're only intending on being in the Championship for a year, so by all means, you keep going. You go out on loan, do well. If you're going to turn that into a permanent, great. If not, you've got another year as a relatively young player at an elite level. Within you're at a top five Euro league somewhere. So when you come back to the Premier League next year, we're going to be much better equipped as a team to deal with that because you've got more top level experience, which again then pushes the transfer value up. Even when you look at some of the signings that they've made, obviously in the summer there and previous windows, obviously while they've been here, but I think the key ones have got to be the January window and the summer window that they've made. They are so good they've probably got the perfect model for somebody like Coppin to work under, because they're very good at that data-driven model. That's where they've brought boys like Tamako over from was it Fusha Dortmund? He came from. He came from Bundesliga too. If they picked him up for 3 4 million pound, now if somebody went in to go and buy him, easily talking upwards on north of 12 million pound comfortably. And it's very, such a good. That's that sporting pedigree within,
Yeah.
of
And it's that player trading model, and it's something that we've been crying out for, and it's been spoken about ad nauseum for the last 2 or 3 years. That's something that we need to get much better at, and I think probably this summer, despite the story we broke last night regarding Yanis Hadji potentially going out the door in the summer, potentially on a free. Tom Lawrence likely to do the same, but there are saleable assets that have been brought in cheap that can be sold on potentially for a decent profit.
hmm
Guys like Hamza Yaman, Kiefte, Nico Raskin, even
yep.
potentially. And whilst there's probably no real desire from a Rangers perspective to sell all of them, then all it's going to take is one or two of them to go and then start the process again where you've got some capital to play with. And I think that's something that they have to do this summer, whether the takeover happens or not. And I think we're much better placed this year to do that than certainly where we were last year.
And I think that's also really important as well as much as we were all furious when the financials came out. I think we all knew this year with things like the stadium improvements and the fiasco that went on with the steel, and you know we've already done those podcasts there. We've been there, done that, saw the t-shirts and had the sleepless nights. You know, but we knew that the finances weren't going to be pretty this year, and this was probably the ugliest set of books that were probably ever going to be produced. We were probably right up there. Um, but now those things are no longer roadblocks. For example, for new investors or even the current regime to continue under. I think it's I think obviously with the likes of the January window and stuff, we were screaming out we need bodies, we need this, we need that. But quite clearly it makes sense now as to why not much investment was done other than the loan signing of Fernandez, which based on current minutes and everything else, I've got a funny feeling that doesn't really go anywhere. I think it was brought in basically to fill a hole until the end of the season. But I think, as you say, I think when you start looking at things like that player trading model, you look at a player like Egerman, for example. Some of the numbers getting bandied about from, in the January, I think some fans were getting a little bit too giddy and too excited about, 25, 30 million pound. I think that's a just hold on to your horse for a minute, Skippy. Like, I think a sensible figure that we would listen to would probably be somewhere in the region of about 15 million pound.
Well,
given his
fairly healthy sell on in there as well if he continues to develop, and I think that that's something that's wise and sensible. I think what Rangers have been very guilty of over the course of the last kind of 4 or 5 years is not selling at the top of the curve, and we only really did it with Calvin Bassey, and we need to be better at that. And listen, this pod isn't necessarily about player trading and transfers, but it's about trying to get that model correct. And
Mhm.
listen, having more people in the building that are good at that sort of thing can only help us along that road. And with getting a sporting director in as well, will probably then allow Niels Coppin to get back to what the day job really was meant to be for him all along. And I think that's massively important in terms of what the new football operations structure will look like, whether that's with or without Philippe Clement. And there's obviously still massive question marks over that in terms of what that looks like for next season, and probably the next 12 weeks or so will determine what that looks like in the summer. But we will get there when we get there.
But I think as well, obviously, with the news that's come out, I think it also explains why maybe Clement hasn't been sacked before now.
100%.
Because if you're the current owners and you're in talks to actively sell, or part of the groups in talks to actively sell, because still at this moment in time we don't know which arms are and which arms aren't selling, or if the whole thing's going up. We're that's still the let's put the pieces of the jigsaw together when the full jigsaw's there ready to be put together. But if you're the current board, why would you sack a manager that you're going to basically leave either a new owner to pay whatever the payment is, figures range depending on source, you know, but or do you then have to take that one final financial hit and then leave caretakers in charge of the club between now and the end of the season? But again, that's still an additional responsibility that do you particularly want to do? I still think, I think this also explains Clement's extension last year as well, because I do think the current incumbents knew that something like this was coming, and I think they knew that this year was going to be relatively volatile. Not maybe quite as white knuckle as it's been throughout the season, but I think everybody knew, and I think one day when we're all old and greyer, than we are now.
Listen,
uh, Listen, mate, I'm just lucky I've got poor lighting where I'm sitting just now. Otherwise, I'd look like Santa sitting over here. Like, but the way I look at that is, I think one day the truth's going to come out about how much Clement had been doing behind the scenes and how much Coppin had been doing well over and above the actual job expectation, that they actually set out to do, and be very in keeping of the current stewardship, to have sold us a picture of this, but actually presented, here's a 1,000-piece Lego set, but you're actually only get 999 pieces to put together.
that argues maybe not even needed as many as them, but that's a conversation for another time. Let's take a quick look at the kind of timeline then, Mitch, because BBC tonight have added a bit more detail, a bit more meat to the bones, and again, whether or not you listen to Tom English or not, but the story that's came out from Tom English tonight on the BBC is that the new prospective owners, the 49ers group, led by Parag Marath, are looking to acquire more than 50% of current Rangers shares. And it's thought that the deal could be done by as early as April, but certainly by June, which would mean obviously by the time that the new season comes on board. So certainly nothing signed at the moment, but very much looking like that's the case. And the new owners will reportedly take on the debt, and a lot of that obviously currently under
To the
John
Bennett family.
Bennett's kind of name, and he's kind of got that there at the moment. But looking obviously at the way that the investors are at the moment, Dave King, obviously the biggest shareholder, 13% ownership at the moment through new Oasis assets. Douglas Park at 11.5, George Taylor at 10.22, you've got Stuart Gibson at 9.5%, and then you get down to the likes of John Bennett at 7%, and Club 1872 obviously still
And
having
George
a bit of a
Latham in
share as
there as
well.
well, somewhere
You've
as
got
well.
George Latham, you've got Brita Investments, Perron Investments. So there's lots of people with fingers in the pie. And obviously, an additional kind of added complication is obviously the SFA rules around kind of dual ownership. And obviously, this has been a big story in Scottish football recently, given the likes of Bill Foley, Bournemouth owner, putting
That's
money
right.
into Hibs this year. Tony Bloom of Brighton put money into Hearts. So Article 13 from the SFA rulebook states that, except with prior written consent of the board, no club or nominee of a club, or no person, whether absolutely or as a trustee, either alone or in conjunction with one or more associates, or solely through an associate or associates, keep up here, even where such person has a formal interest in another club, may have any more than what's meant to be 30% of a club. So, whilst there may well be a kind of desire from the 49ers at the moment in terms of like how much of the pie they look to try and take, how much of that is kind of acquired against Marath's part of it, given his investment in Leeds at the moment and his involvement there. However, we've also seen stories come out of Leeds today, regarding Red Bull potentially looking to have a bit more of a
Take
say
the
in what
stake.
Leeds are all about. And we've seen stories regarding the actual San Francisco 49ers looking at selling 10% of their um, holdings to other parties. So I think that there's an awful lot of moving parts here, and a lot to come out in the wash.
I think when we look at timelines and stuff, to go back to where we were, I think you can piece 90% of the jigsaw together as to where we are now, and I keep using the jigsaw analogy because there is so many pieces. I think it's quite clear that talks have probably been ongoing from September, October time, depending on, you know, how formal or informal they were. And then obviously we were introduced to the idea of new investors at the AGM. We also had Dave King's comments back in September about overseas money and people from overseas being interested, which again makes you wonder, had he potentially already been holding informal conversations, or we don't want to be like the eunuch for Game of Thrones here, saying that Dave King has been the wee man in the corner there that knew everything. But then you start to say, well, the club and the current stewardship and those who are going to sell, those who will remain, or if the whole thing's going to, again, big question mark on that part. Those conversations have clearly been ongoing from about November to, let's say, late January, around about the time that the review was announced, the external review. We've all been able to piece together that, it doesn't take Stephen Hawking to figure out that review is in fact probably part of a due diligence process, but probably not quite part of an exclusivity process at the moment. So the next stages of takeovers, expansions, and bits and pieces like that will always be I call it the pre-red tape stuff, where you've got all the parties have got to announce it to the stock market. People who are people who are selling have got to announce, etc. This is why I genuinely think I wouldn't be surprised if the announcement was made early April into Easter, and that 1st of June is probably somewhere about a dot in the i's, crossing the t's of the paperwork, and on the 1st of June we will be told the quiet thing that we've known for about 3 months at that point out loud of 49ers Group have bought X percentage stake in the club. I think when it comes to satisfying the rules, whether that be SFA rules, UEFA rules, etc., about how much individual entities can own of the club, I wouldn't be overly shocked if, you know, and I know Leeds have done this with some of the ownership model and stuff like that down there, where certain celebrities and sports stars own small percentages of Leeds, like where it's like 1-2% here. It's people like Russell Crowe. It's people like a couple of golfers in there. I think Justin Rose maybe might be wrong, but Russell Crowe's involved in it. Will Ferrell's involved in it. You've got a couple of famous faces involved where they'll all hold X percent of a stake. You'd imagine that probably something similar would happen here, that where maybe McGrath's part of it will hold, let's say, 29% of it, just as I kind of throw a number out there, and then maybe another 29 to 30% owned by another prominent figure, call it, and then probably, let's say, sprinkle about 10% of other ownership shares between, faces, names and faces. And I wouldn't be
Yeah,
shocked to
and
see a
there
lot
may
of kind
well
of British
be,
footballers in there, maybe
yeah,
retired ones.
and there may well be a desire from some of the current incumbents to hold on a piece of it.
Hmm.
The likes of the Parks, the Bennett family, for example, might not be a complete sell the whole lot. And I think that's something that can't be ruled out either at this
Hmm.
stage. And that's where I think a lot of it will come out in the wash over the course of the next wee while. But I think it's very clear, and it's probably something we'll end on, is that talks wouldn't have got to this stage if there wasn't a desire for something like this to happen, or for them to have an indication that the shop's open, and that there's business to be done. And I think that that's the interesting part here, is that I think if there's willingness on both sides, then this will be something that will happen. And I think it's just a case of seeing that process through now, in terms of making sure that both sides are happy with whatever part of the deal is done. But as you say, a lot of work still to be done.
That's it, mate. And I think the picture will become clearer to us all, I think, over not so much the coming days, because I think we're getting fed a lot of information now that's obviously been in the background for weeks and weeks and weeks. If they've managed to keep that under the lid for this length of time, there's probably a whole lot of other things still going on that nobody knows about yet. And I think probably the interesting time will probably be around about the end of next month, start of April, where if we start to see bits of Leeds, for example, getting sold to the Red Bull Group, where, say, for argument's sake, Red Bull bought 15% of the shares or whatever over in Leeds or something, as always, where there's a will, there's a way. But right now we'll take it. We'll sit in the cloud that we are, and we'll get the hearts ready if we need to.
Absolutely, and I think what it does do is it probably allows a bit of context, and probably allows people just to calm down a wee bit, because I think that the last kind of couple of months have been very fraught. And listen, it's given us plenty of content to speak about. But I think we could all do with a bit of a rest, and given the fact that there's not a huge amount left to play for other than Europe this season, so it probably allows time just for everything probably to calm down a little bit and be slightly less toxic than potentially what this weekend against St Mirren could have been, before this news obviously broke yesterday, because now we now see something possible on the horizon that gives the belief that there may well be better times ahead. And I think as a fan, that's all you can really hope for. And it means when those forms come through your door in 3 or 4 weeks' time to say, "Are you wanting
I
to renew
part with
again?"
some
Then
cash.
um, there's probably going to be a lot less reluctance from people to be able to do it, because they can see, right, that there's something new there, as opposed to more of the same old, that possibly would have been a harder sell in terms of another season of not quite being up at it. And listen, that even if this deal does get done, it doesn't mean it's an overnight um,
Yeah,
recovery, and you're right back
the
to
tap's
the
not
top
getting
table.
turned on.
No, not at all. And obviously, FFP's there to ensure that doesn't happen. But it does give a bit of hope, and it does give a bit of belief that actually better times may well be ahead. And I think at this stage, that's all we can really hope for. That this is a bit of belief that better times are coming.
And I will say, I think as fans, and I'm going to my closing thoughts. Probably the best way I'll sum it up.
All
Uh,
right, Jerry.
Dave Dave King's comments about investor fatigue in September kind of ring very true from a fan perspective now. I think of we've almost got fatigue from the investors at this point, where everybody kind of quietly knows that maybe for the last year or two, the current owners have taken us as far as they can, and we know that, they know that, but nobody really wants to kind of say that. And I think, I think that's probably where we're at now, where we're like, if there's something fresh, something not always bigger and better, but if there's something new there, then it gives us reasons to be glasses half full than half empty.
Absolutely. That feels like a good place to end this one. Big thank you to everyone that watched obviously the breaking news video that went out last night. In terms of the fourth official here on YouTube, one of our fastest growing and mostly viewed videos in over a 24-hour period. So big thank you to everyone that tuned in for that one. Hopefully you've enjoyed this one as well and you've stuck with us over the course of the last half an hour. Loads as always coming up on the fourth official on both our platforms here on YouTube, also over on Patreon www.patreon.com/the fourth official. You can get all our coverage. That's your podcasts, your match reactions, your opinion, your interviews, your columns, all for less than £3 a month. We'll be over there at the weekend with St Mirren coming to Ibrox on Saturday and loads more besides. A big thank you to you all for watching. I'll speak to you next time. Goodbye.